Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here. As you're logging in, I'm seeing we're getting quite a few scrolling in. Drop in the chat. Tell me where you're from. I'm looking forward to seeing who we've all got on. So we'll start in another minute or two. Let all the kind of participants roll in. Again, welcome everyone. I think we've got another couple hundred in already. So thanks for joining. I really appreciate it. We're going to still wait another minute because we're still seeing some pretty fast streaming in. So drop in the chat where you're from, so you can see each other and so we can see where you're all from. And also, if you have technical questions, you're having issues hearing me or something, also you can add those questions in the chat. Sort of not knowing when to start. It's like the microwave popcorn. Is it like one pop per second? Uh, we're at about another 100 are in now. Thank you again. I'm going to let it slow down a little bit longer in case there's a little bit of a lag here. But thank you for being here. All right. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started and welcome you all to the 2024 in review and 2025 trends presentation. It's one of my favorite presentations I get the privilege of presenting each year, looking at the year that went by, really as we're in the throes of the beginning of a new year. And kind of reflect on the year past. And as I go back through old presentations, it sort of serves as an almanac for me. And I've been certainly privileged. My name is Josh Birkholz. I've been privileged to be on the board of Giving USA. I think it was my 13th year being involved on committees or boards with Giving USA, having recently completed my term as chair. So I've had a wonderful view of sort of the landscape and charitable landscape. And also from my role as CEO of BWF, working directly with nonprofit organizations, several hundred each year, where we get to see what's happening in their world, the challenges they're running into, the opportunities. And it's really just kind of fun for me to have a conversation. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with all of you. Just kind of the housekeeping things you're probably used to, but if you have a question, I do really want to try to answer some questions towards the end. Please put those in the Q&A feature. If you have a technical question, put it in the chat, along with where so many of you welcome have put in the chat where you're from. And I'm seeing all over from DC to Atlanta. I see someone from South Africa. Thank you. I know from Switzerland as well. So around the world, thank you for attending. I really appreciate all of you. One from Kenya is in addition. So it's a true international group, and I'm really excited. Just so you know, I know you might be taking notes. I talk sometimes fast. It's a problem. I'm going to do it anyways, but you have the benefit of a recording. In about 24, 48 hours, the next day or two, you'll get an email with the recording of this presentation. So you'll have a copy of it if you need to refer back. And then certainly, I also have a QR code at the end with my LinkedIn, which you can welcome to send me questions directly. I will try to get to them. Thank you so much for that and for connecting and letting me be part of your day today. For some of you, I know it's in the evening and some it's early morning. Thank you for attending. I'm gonna just get right on into the presentation and talk a little bit about 2024. We just finished really a remarkable year, and let's look back on it. I mean, some things have not changed, but a lot of things have changed. In fact, I was Just last night, I have to admit, sometimes when I subscribe to a streaming service, I try to binge a bunch of the shows to decide if I want to keep the subscription. Well, I subscribe to the PBS documentaries, and I've been going through probably every Ken Burns documentary there is. And last night, I just watched the one on the Mayo Clinic. And I just thought it was so cool. I'm calling from Minnesota, so of course we're very proud of the medical center from our state, the Mayo Clinic, and just their stories of how that first hospital, though, St. Mary's Hospital, which became the broader Mayo Clinic, how that began with a $40,000 campaign by the Sisters of St. Francis, how they raised their money to build that first hospital in the 1800s. To at that time, healthcare and hospitals were very much like a private business. To Will and Charlie Mayo in the earlier 1900s, I want to say it was in the 1920s, when they said, we're making way too much money, they put the money into a trust so that healthcare would be a democracy where they had a board and really kind of establish how a nonprofit is. It was a $1.5 million gift to that trust from the Mayo brothers. And just thinking from the Sisters of St. Francis to those Mayo brothers, how in an unaided way they just chose to step forward. They saw a problem that people needed to be better. It was important to humanity, and they made that choice. And that ripple effect today to have a world-class medical center all the way back to what was really a wonderful story of philanthropy. I love to hear those stories, not only in a Ken Burns documentary, but for those of us in fundraising, we see those stories every day. We see those donors that chose to step up and make something amazing. We see the impact, whether it's cures that emerged during our tenures. We're seeing land being preserved, new arts programming that's just amazing, students getting scholarships. It's really a fun profession. I can't think of a more rewarding and meaningful place to be. So as we look back at 2024, uh, what strikes me in this last year is we've come through a lot of change, and perhaps this is yeah, we get it, Josh. We've been here too. These last 5 years have been some of the biggest changes. I even went back to tax legislation from 2017, the Tax Cuts and Job Act, where we started to see how tax policy affected fundraising, especially in that mid-level where we saw some declines on the itemizers, but also during that period, perhaps that was financially good for a certain segment and the high net worth, which stepped up in philanthropy in some ways. Uh, of course, the COVID-19 and racial justice in 2020 really marked some changes there. Um, Inflation through last year was probably the biggest story. Perhaps this year, elections are a little bit more of a story, especially this week. A lot of questions about federal grants and what's going to happen with those being stopped and then the stop being frozen. Regardless of where that goes, it really points how important philanthropic revenue is and how critical philanthropy is to a lot of great things happening. We've had conflicts and challenges, natural disasters and international conflicts, certainly in really a couple decades of donor declines. Declines in the United States and really globally, even though the dollars have been going up, continuing to beg different questions about what's happening with the charitable landscape. And when we think about the inflation, which dominated so much of the last few years, it's both a combination of real and perceived. In many ways, inflation got below 3% in 2024, so it showed a real leveling off. People have been trying to get it down to that 2.5, down to 2, maybe it bumped up to 2.9 at the beginning of this year, but it's really been levels. But there's been a cumulative effect of inflation. When we look at those 7, 6.5, and 3.4, to actually be like it was before would need the negatives of that same amount. So cumulatively, things cost more, and we know that. And there's the question we've asked, you've heard me ask, if someone's trying to decide between milk and eggs or putting gas in their car or helping their kid with their school supplies or whatever have essential needs, it's very difficult to find that extra money for charity, which has certainly affected the middle class. But not only have those been real, there's also been perceived economic headwinds. I'm not sure where the economy is going. We've seen in the past when there's perceptions of economic headwinds that pledge activity can sometimes be depressed, where you might see still payments against pledges, but kind of a headwinds against making future choices around philanthropy. And we saw a little bit of that, although by the end of the year, we're seeing financial numbers going up and actually seeing a good deal of optimism from the high net worth group, which has been giving. This everyday donor decline, though, it's been the story. It was the story last year, the year before. It was probably the biggest story in terms of what the press covered, from the Chronicle of Philanthropy and those within our profession to those outside of the profession. New York Times and The Economist. We saw many articles around everyday donor declines, really asking questions: has giving become for the rich? Is that the world we're in now? Is this a rich person's game? But some would counter that in some ways, the definitions of generosity have been changing because we've seen growth in personal giving and benevolence to individuals, like with GoFundMe and so forth, as well as volunteering. There's been some good indications of volunteering happening, and also just being benevolent in tips and those stories like that. And some would say perhaps there's more of an authenticity issue because the numbers show that the everyday donor has been declining in giving to registered charities. But when I'm giving to an individual, I can authentically see my impact of my $100 makes that person's life better. I can see when I'm giving a tip that that person, I see that happiness. There's an authenticity of an impact. If I'm giving $100 to a charity and I get a thank you letter, but I'm not quite sure where that money went, does it feel the same way? Can we provide that same sort of feeling of authentic connection and impact? Well, many would argue that perhaps individuals don't believe that they much have impact at the lower levels, although they do believe that the community has impact. Has our messaging shifted? Like, for example, are we so focused on impact we're forgetting some of the intrinsic value, like giving is a good thing. It's a cultural value. This giving is what people like us do. It's something that we do as part of our humanity. And some of those messages, it's been indicated partly through the Generosity Commission, which we'll talk later, do matter. They do matter for the everyday person. But overall, last year at this time, I mentioned how the trust was plummeting. It dropped down to 52% of America's trust nonprofits. That was below big business and below government, and just slightly ahead and slightly behind the news media in terms of large institutions and people's level of trust. And this comes from research done by Edelman. In 2024, we actually saw that number jump up a little bit. It went up 5 points, which is a pretty good jump up. And so I think there's been great work in the nonprofit sector of demonstrating their value. We're seeing this turn, which is a wonderful thing. This has been a declining number for some time, and we're starting to see that turn. And there's always been the case where donors themselves, people that do give, do have a higher level of trust. Of course, that makes sense. Those that don't give rate lower levels of trust. But also that even those that don't trust nonprofits or say that they don't trust them, they do trust the ones in their backyard or the ones they know. So they know the nonprofits that they know they trust, the ones they don't know they don't. So it's more of a general statement of the sector. But we're seeing slightly from an independent sector study that also came out last year was that fewer believe that nonprofits are making things better than they were before. So the trust is up, but maybe, and again, this is a different mechanism, a different population, but the believing that nonprofits are actually making things better is at about 45%. So there's maybe some trust that they're trying, 45% believe that they're succeeding. So, uh, of course, this is higher education was the one that was climbing even or declining even more precipitously. Actually, even though it's about a third of U.S. adults have little to no confidence in higher education, it's actually a little better than it was before. It was a little bit more than that. In 2023. And higher education has had more than just being part of the broader nonprofit sector with opportunities to show value and impact and effectiveness. It's also struggled with other protesting of international events, questions around affirmative action changes, the high cost of education, and being part of the political fray in the election season. So those have all had some impact, but it's slightly a little bit better. So we're seeing a little bit of increase in trust. It's still not where we'd love it to be. As I counted last year, the last couple of years from a generational study that looked at giving by generations, where all the predominant generations by the common nomenclature, your greatest generation, your boomers, Gen X, millennial, Gen Z. Uh, Religious giving has been the top charitable destination. It has been as long as Giving USA has measured the numbers. But higher education had been second for the older generations. We saw that start to slip below the third spot for Gen X and down to 4, 5, 6 for millennial and then to Gen Z. So we're seeing as a counterbalance some climb in the younger generations around environmental giving and in healthcare. Health partly attributable to coming through the pandemic period, but perhaps other factors where we're seeing a little shift generationally that a lot of people are paying attention to. In fact, in the last 2 years in Giving USA, we saw human services actually pass education for the second highest destination of giving in the United States. It had been education in second for as long as I can remember, and I have to go way back to see when it was otherwise. Now, statistically, they're pretty close to a tie, but in current dollars, human services, people gave more to human services the last 2 years than to education. Now, throughout all the change, giving actually remained quite resilient, and it continues to be resilient. People give even when times are tough, even when the perceptions of times being tough persist. Now, the numbers back in 2021 were very high. Part of this is inflation adjustment and new data coming up from the IRS, but really 2021 was a peak year. And a lot of the economic indicators were really high that year too, like the S&P 500, consumer confidence. Following the pandemic, there was a momentary bit of big optimism. As you recall, at the end of 22, we saw a big dive in the S&P 500, and that was enough to pull giving down as well. There's a lot of people that gift their gains and maybe sell their losses, as it were, and the gifting of the gains sort of disappeared. And now statistically, it was sort of flat this from 22 to 23, slight increase in current dollars, slight decrease in inflation adjusted dollars because inflation was high in 2022. Now, 2024, the year we've just completed, the numbers are not going to be able to be calculated until about June is when you'll see those. The last week of June, I think it's the last Tuesday of June, you'll see the final numbers on 2024. But most economists are actually pretty optimistic. The drivers that have had correlation in the statistics with giving were largely up, and there was a good stock market end to the year. So the perception is that 2024 will be an up year, and many of the economists are feeling that that is going to be the case. But we'll have to wait and see because economists aren't always right. They think they are, so don't tell them that if you're an economist, yep, you're always right. But I do believe that there's pretty good evidence of growth. Now, what we've been seeing is a trend that also relates to that everyday donor decline. Is there's the four sectors that have the largest proportion of high net worth giving are foundations, public society benefit, education, and then arts, culture, and the humanities. It should be noted that academic medicine is included in education and not health. So there's some portion of health that is in education by how everyday people would consider healthcare to exist. And foundations being the largest recipient, which is where a lot of the wealthy donors, because when they set up a family foundation, that's considered a gift to a foundation. When they set up a donor advised fund at a community foundation, that's a gift to a foundation. So giving to charitable foundations, giving to structured mechanisms. Public society benefit also benefits from that because while public society benefit includes the larger category of United Way and federated charities, it also includes the national donor advised fund sponsoring organizations, such as Fidelity Charitable, Schwab, Vanguard. Those would fall into the public society benefit area. So many feel this is a donor advised fund growth. Education and arts and culture and humanities have had a historic business model aligned to the high net worth, more so in education, arts and culture, more of an alignment in terms of somewhat business model and somewhat just their constituency leans towards that area a little bit more so than other constituencies. Now, where we've seen the least high net worth giving has been in religion and international affairs, which only had slight gains in terms of the recent trends. Those are largely historically been more middle class charities, even though there's certain examples, some of the larger within each respective segment are using really adopting business models very similar to a higher education. Things like prospect development, major gift work, principal gifts, comprehensive campaign business models, which have been really proven factors in growing high net worth philanthropy. So we've really seen some shifts there. And it also should be pointed out that um, while in the donor population, there's what many people call haves and have-nots. Perhaps that's a good way to describe it. I don't know. It's the one I hear quite often. There's very wealthy people, their wealth has increased, and correspondingly their giving has increased. Perhaps there's even more wealth that they have that they're not giving, but nevertheless, that wealth increase does seem related to philanthropy increases. And then there's people, everyday donors, where their wealth has not been increasing and their income has been strained and perhaps more subject to the shocks of inflation and other factors. But within that, within these segments, we see these numbers and say, hey, I'm in arts and culture humanities and I didn't see 11% growth, or I'm in the environment and animals and we didn't see over 8% growth in the last year. And the reality is there's also haves and have-nots within the nonprofit landscape. What we find is dare I say, mature or the more complex organizations are more geared in business models to attract those high-level donors. And we know that the high net worth donors do perceive a lot of their giving very similar to how investments are made. Who do I think is most likely to solve this problem? So they often prefer bigger, more complex, more mature, lasting, sustainable organizations. So we're also seeing that there's large organizations within each segment that are likely pulling up the numbers, while there might be people and organizations within each segment that are declining. Nevertheless, the overall total dollar amounts, and this data would be from IRS data as well as other data sources, did see growth in the last year. So I talked about giving to those foundations and setting up the donor advised funds and public society benefit. Certainly, this is something that we're all likely familiar with. But part of that too is a lot of people have been pointing out this pie chart is the ones that's been catching a lot of people's attention. So this is going back 40 years. This was from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, who's a research partner of Giving USA. And they pointed out in 83 when they did their analysis, total giving, 82% of the numbers that year were from individuals. In 2023, the last complete year on record, that was 67% from individuals. And that number continues to be on a decline. Meanwhile, the foundation number that went from 6% to 19% has been on a continual increase. It has been climbing. And as we kind of dig into this, most experts agree that it's around 83 to 85% of giving decisions are still made by individuals making that choice to make that gift. And especially if you add in bequests, these are individuals that made that during their lifetime. It's perhaps even higher than that in a large proportion. But what's different is how they're making that gift is often passing through different structured means, either through structured foundations or donor advised funds, or even how they're setting up their own structured gifts through life income, charitable gift annuities, and so forth. And in fact, we're seeing a big growth at the individual level in structured gift. In fact, talking with some of the providers of life income from recently, Caspec, I just had a conversation with Caspec, and they had mentioned that charitable gift annuities has been on a real climb this last year. Seen real growth there. We're seeing growth in life income gifts. And I could say from a consulting perspective, we work with many organizations. We've had more requests to help equip major gift officers and principal gift officers, as well as prospect researchers and prospect development teams, to better understand the complexity of assets. So it's not just this person has a lot of money, they could give a big gift, and we ask for the gift, and then we try to figure out how. But we're a little bit more proactive in understanding the assets and how those assets might be used for different ways of giving. The QCDs has been one area that we've seen growth in, certainly, and DAFs. Both of those kind of solve a problem, make things easier as well as being better for the donor. But other areas that are better for the donor are sometimes very difficult for us to explain. So there's been also a lot of development and training around gift construction skills. I was just talking with Jake Lemon from University of Kentucky, who might be on the call. If so, hi, Jake. And I remember him saying how some of his best gift discussions have been almost like a financial advisor, talking with them about how, not just if. And I think that's a skill set we're seeing definitely develop as we see a growth in structured philanthropy in terms of the organizations, whether it's foundations, donor advised funds, or perhaps even companies like LLCs or B Corps and other ways that people might be structuring their benevolence to, at the individual level, skill sets to work with people in structuring individual mechanisms. So it's important to mention that the asset mix is very different for the wealthy. While I'm a big proponent, and I'll talk in several slides on how I think it's so important that we build this base of support for the sustainability of this sector, it's also important to know that high net worth is capturing a big part of the philanthropic pie. So we do need to understand that population as well. This is a wonderful chart from the Federal Reserve that was brought to my attention by Pyro Solutions, a prospect research company out of the UK that's perhaps one of the best at business assets. And what they were pointing out here is, just to acclimate you to the chart, is the rows, 10K, 100K, a million, 10 million, 100 million, and a billion, are net worth. So these are individuals measured by the Federal Reserve and their estimated net worth. Then in the color-coded segments, which might be difficult to read, but I could give you at a high level, kind of the orangish and red are real property. The green are more liquid cash, and the blue tones are more business interests, with the dark blue being actual company assets, the lighter blue being stock holdings. And what we find is in the lower levels of net worth, that your house and your property are your top philanthropic assets. And those are perhaps the easiest to find. That's why when we do a wealth screening, we see lots of real estate returns, because that's a publicly available asset because of fair taxation. It's disclosed at the county level and aggregated by the screening companies. But what we see is as we get higher in net worth, the property becomes a lower portion of the broader capacity picture, and it's largely business interests. So our ability to understand business interests, how people can give from their business interests, how we can assess capacity from business interests are really imperative areas, and an area of a lot of focus in the prospect development community to how to be more effective at understanding the asset picture of our high net worth donors. And in fact, also from Pyro Solutions, this is also from Fidelity, is where they had found the source of this data, is that they had estimated that 90.4% of major gift wealth, so this is wealth that is given through major gifts, had its origin from business and market interests. And 88% of this are self-made company owners. It's really the people that started and built their companies, founders, entrepreneurs, self-made wealth, are the most philanthropic segment in terms of major gift wealth. About 3% of the major gift wealth is inherited, 2.4% is in public company shares through success of previously established companies, and 6.6% from all other. So really pointing out the importance of business interests and understanding what's happening in the charitable landscape is how business income, business assets are being converted towards gifts and driving the overall landscape. Now, part of this is something that many of us in fundraising have known for many years, is that assets are more related to giving than income is. Many of us newer to it are like, I'm going to look for high income individuals. People that have been established realize we're looking for high asset individuals. Now, everybody gives from their assets once they retire, because now you're living off of your assets. When you're working, you're living off of your income. And people that give from their income tend to hover in that either the base level or the mid-level of giving. A lot of mid-level gifts might be the upper end of where income-based giving is. We see more seasonality, people giving according to what's beneficial from a tax perspective and so forth. But those at the higher net worth are more closely related to assets. So when we see measurements in the macroeconomic picture or economic conditions in markets in the United States and microeconomics, we find that those assets are a bigger drive on what's happening in philanthropy. So the S&P 500 is perhaps one of the best ones to look at. Now you can see on this chart here, the S&P 500 is the sort of yellow or goldish color line, and the dotted line is giving. Now it's correlated, but you can tell giving is not as spiky as the S&P 500. So while it's correlated, it's also more resilient to those shocks and dips and climbs where it will go up when it goes up and it won't go down as much when it goes down, but not to the same peaks and valleys. And we've seen that tighten in more recent years. In the last decade or so, it's been even tighter in terms of the correlation between the S&P 500 and giving. And that's because a lot of those gifts are given from appreciated assets. There's some degree of um, a smoothing effect in structured philanthropy, like with foundations and donor advised funds. People, as I mentioned before, might gift their gains. The stock market's up. I'm going to fund my donor advised fund or my foundation through appreciated assets. But when the stock market is down, I'm not going to fund that year. I might sell those assets because that's a tax advantage. Gifting my gains is a tax advantage, but then I'm seeing a smoothing in my giving through that structuring. The giving might not follow those same spikes if it's going through a structured method. So we're trying to pay attention to the smoothing effect of the structuring. But in addition to individuals who I mentioned had a broader view of giving and philanthropy, that benevolence is not just giving to charities, but it is like GoFundMe and other things. We've noticed that corporations have been talking about their social good role or their social good obligations in ways that extend beyond charitable giving. In the past, they would have a portion of their profits that would go to charitable gifts. Now that's still the case, but we'll also see other social impact investing in activities, environmental commitments, volunteer time off policies, even employee programs around inclusion and welcoming and so forth. All are things that in a corporation's mind is good things that we're doing, benevolent activities. And it's hard to argue that these things are benevolent activities. But we've seen certainly in the trends, even though giving has been going up from corporations in the last year, it did go up the last complete year on record. What we've been seeing as a larger trend, as can be seen in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, that there's been a slow decline of the percent of their giving, or their giving as a percent of their profits, their pre-tax profits in those years, where we were seeing numbers as high as 2% a few decades back. It's been dropping to below. In fact, it was down to 0.7 and 0.8 in recent years, slightly up this year, but it's more solidly at the 1% or slightly below than it has been at the 2% that we had seen in past years. So corporate giving has been trending down as a percent of profits, even though that's been increasing. Now, it's important because corporate giving, and I'll mention this a little bit more when I talk about the Generosity Commission, is increasing as in its importance in a role, even for our base of support. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, what most people mention when they think of economics and giving is they think about the GDP, the gross domestic product, because giving coincidentally has been about 2% of the GDP. If you think of the whole GDP in the United States, giving the amount of giving, which is slightly over $500 billion, is roughly 2% of that number. But what we've found in the last 5 years is it hasn't been a leading indicator. We've seen GDP go up when giving went down, and GDP go down when giving went up. But it's still a good correlation, partly because GDP is probably more reflective of middle class and middle class giving in terms of where production, unemployment, and things that factor into the everyday person more so than the high net worth. Now that's a sweeping statement. Certainly there's components of both within it, but it's declining as an indicator. Like we can't look at the GDP and predict what giving is like we used to. It's more related to the asset markets. So I mentioned the Generosity Commission, and I think this is a really important occurrence that happened. The Generosity Commission was a commission in Washington on everyday actions, extraordinary potential, the power of giving and volunteering, looking at how to re-spark this cultural value of giving. And there hasn't been a commission on this nonprofit sector in giving since the Filer Commission in 1975. So if you think this is kind of a big deal that we had a commission this last year in 2024, it's a really big thing. If we look back historically, 2024 is the year the Generosity Commission happened. I was honored to be at the presentation of this in Washington back in September and lead a panel of experts digging into this research that was funded by many big funders, generosity of companies like BWF, who was a donor to the commission, and many of those of the Giving Institute, but also big foundations like the Gates, the Rockefellers, Jerry Stead, and others, really generous individuals giving towards this commission. And this multi-year project hired researchers from many universities and like the Lilly School and University of Maryland's Do Good Institute, Stanford. There was many researchers involved in the study. And I'm not going to read through all of their findings, and this is actually even abbreviations upon the recommendations, but it's a free report. Go to the generositycommission.org and look at those findings. I think it will be informative for those that are nerds about philanthropy like me and a student of this business. On how we can increase our data, closing this evidence and practice gap, advocacy from leaders to talk about their own giving and the benefits. One of the things that came to mind for me was there was a special faith and giving segment, which is related to secular giving in a lot of ways. We've seen through research from the Lake Institute and others, most notably the Lake Institute, that those that are religiously affiliated and very active historically have given about 4 times more to secular charities than the non-religiously active individuals. So many jump to the conclusion that there's a faith drive to giving, and it's hard to argue that. It's in many faith traditions, in Muslim, Jewish, Christian, many faith groups encourage generosity. But what was pointed out is that modeling and where people first saw giving was through faith-based mechanisms. So a kid seeing the proverbial offering plate being passed around every week, if they were a family that went to their church every week and they saw their parents giving was modeled for them multiple times per year. And now what we found is a lot of times people's first exposure to giving was not through a faith tradition, but actually through a workplace giving program. So I mentioned there's a role for corporations to play, that oftentimes when a corporation has a workplace giving, for many people, that's the first time they thought about philanthropy and how to equip companies to just for the benefit of this whole sector, to encourage them to continue doing that type of work and how that encourages a new behavior of giving. So there's much more. I'm not going to have this be a whole Generosity Commission report, but I do encourage you to download from the www.thegenerositycommission.org. Wonderful report. Lots of great work, and thanks to everyone who's involved, the donors and the researchers and those leading as volunteers. Now, one of the bright spots, I talked about the decline of the everyday donor, but we've also seen some bright spots, like we saw that bright spot in terms of 5% growth in trust from the everyday person. The other one was Giving Tuesday. Now, last year, so in 2023, the year before 2024, Giving Tuesday raised the same amount of money that it did in 2022. So it was basically statistically flat. It had a good year. There's a lot of money that was given, but there was almost a 10% decline in the number of people that gave on Giving Tuesday. So actually, in a microcosm of a single day, we saw more and more giving from higher net worth, less giving from everyday folks. In 2024, though, we actually saw a 7% increase in participation, the number of people that gave at Giving Tuesday. This was a wonderful example of perhaps messaging going out, perhaps it was economically related, perhaps there's many factors that are worth unpacking, but there was still a 7% growth in participation. Now we saw dollars grow even more, so there's still that separation happening, but just seeing any turn to the positive in the base and everyday giving is a huge positive, and that was a big positive in 2024. Now I've been talking about AI for several years. I think I was going through my slide decks, and I think I had an AI deck back in 2013, and certainly it was about 3 years ago where we saw AI really become part of the common nomenclature with ChatGPT and everything. And certainly in our profession, we've been working our way up to applying AI, at least to the prospect development side of the equation. If you look back through our history, in the 1970s is where we started to have distributed development functions where different people were raising money, then were supporting development or coding gifts, tracking data. So we started to see role distribution. In the 1980s, we started to see the real growth in prospect research, which was the first applied data to fundraising. The founding of APRA, Bobby Strand, a longtime partner at BWF, really being a pioneer in the prospect research profession. In the 1990s, we saw this growth in the comprehensive campaign, which increased the need for prospect identification, and that thrust prospect research from being a pre-solicitation activity of ask setting to also have the responsibility for identifying prospects and feeding a prospect pool. Along the same time, we started to see relational databases with the primary key come together so that our databases had lots of information to be mined. Now, we didn't really know how to mine it yet, but in the 90s, we were really starting to gather more and more data on each individual. In the 2000s, we started to see a growth of applied analytics, much of this being static prediction, like the credit score. Here's people that pay back their loans. How much do you look like them? You get a number that shows how much you look like people that are paying back their loans. Similarly, we would see scores showing how likely someone is to give. Predictive scores, major gift models, and things like that. And in the 2010s, we started to see a shift of using data not as something the operations and the prospect development people do, but something that leadership uses to make decisions. I would say this corresponded with the rise of behavioral economics. People like Thaler, Kahneman, even sort of pop behavioral economists like Levitt, Dan Ariely, where we start to ask questions, what's actually happening? If I'm going to set a growth for next year, is that based in anything? And so we start to see some of the early influence on decision making and also some of the early automation, which kind of preceded machine learning in taking those static models and automating those so that scores would change as the data changed. And now we're at the spot where it's just sort of blown up. It's everywhere, and it's not an AI session, but I did want to talk that like from generating content to certainly prospect identification is more mature than it has ever been. Simulating like how much would we raise if we added more staff, something that perhaps the consulting profession is using a lot more, doing sort of if-thens on different changes and what the result would be, recommending next actions, being a translator, donor journey mapping, understanding perceptions within our marketing automation and so forth. And as a translator, just kind of a quick fun story, and maybe it's only fun for me, but I'm the one talking, so I get to tell it. My daughter recently finished her senior thesis. She's an economics student, and she had called me up and asked for some help on an econometric model, which I have to admit I was like super nerdy and excited that my daughter's asking me for help, and because all three of my daughters are much smarter than I am. But what she was doing, I remember learning how to do 20 years ago in SPSS. Those of you that know that software, the statistical package for the social sciences, which was very common back in the day. It's been acquired by IBM and really evolved quite a bit. It's now called IBM Statistics. And she was using Stata. And I didn't know Stata, but I knew how to do this in SPSS. So what she did is the two of us Zoom called, her from her college dorm, me from my house in Minneapolis, and she brought up a ChatGPT window, and she would ask me a question and how I do an SPSS, and I explained it. And she typed that into ChatGPT and said, "How would you do that in Stata?" And then it answered her. So actually, ChatGPT served as the translator, and it worked very effectively for us to talk even between two platforms. Okay, so I'm nerding out. You're like, move on, Josh. We get it. You like data. All right. But when we look at how it's been applied, perhaps the pipeline and prospect development is where we're seeing the most innovations in the sector, and certainly many more in 2024. From machine learning models to identify prospects, all the way through nudge and prompt and activity generators within the cultivation process. This is a slide I often use when I'm evaluating cost benefit of pipeline work. Just to orient you to the slide, the top of this from the lead gen down, if you think about this, not to scale, but think of this as a measure of value. This is the value of our whole database of prospects. Let's say for a big institution, that could be billions, maybe it's 100 millions. And then on the bottom right is the amount of money we're actually raising. Let's say that's 5 million or 50 million or 500 million, depending on the size of the institution you're with. But whatever it is, it's a very small percentage of the total capacity if we added everybody up. Now, this will often be referred to as a yield rate. How much have we yielded against that capacity? So then it's a question of if this is how much giftable capacity there is, where do the other 95% of that capacity go? And so we well screen or we do models to determine who we're going to research. That's probably the biggest chop. And then the researchers will verify and send that name on to a major gift officer. Not every name they research moves on to a gift officer. When we assign the names, not all names find their way into a portfolio. When they go out for a discovery call, maybe not all names get called, and those that do get called, not all become prospects, but those that become prospects, you can see this number keeps decreasing. Then we're cultivating. And perhaps in this process, research says this is $1 million prospect, but we think we're going to ask for 100,000. There's another 90% at that individual of decline on the amount. We actually ask, maybe that's a smaller amount, and then the actual gift is netted. And what we're seeing is a lot of the technologies are at different steps of this process, from machine learning models to identify prospects to using AI to help with the verification process. To leveraging this data in tool sets to nudge and prompt, to warm up populations, integrate with customer journey orchestration, helping with generative prospect research and matching algorithms, coming up with better ways to assess capacity, all the way to even donor experience content after the gift in terms of sentiment and why do they give and what are those feelings that we can replicate that drove them. So we're seeing AI being applied all over the place, and it seems like perhaps overwhelming. But I always like to remind everyone that you're in the driver's seats. This market is responding. The market of people building these tool sets are responding to market demand. So having a clear picture of here's my business problem, can this technology help solve that, really helps to steer what gets developed for this sector. Now, one of those that often comes in close proximity to AI is talent itself. And this is probably the most perennial slide that I've had every time I've done a year in review, is the talent gap has not been going away. There are more jobs in fundraising than there are people. When we talk about unemployment, we could definitely take more people into the fundraising profession. Now, I know for some of your organizations, your on-job decreases and freezes. So I realize this is a net of the whole sector. But there's a high degree of transiency. We're in a period of increased retirements, job changes, jumping organizations. In fact, retirement's not only affecting our sector. When many people talk about the transfer of wealth that's looming from a plan giving perspective, others are mentioning actually this next 5 years is probably the biggest period of retirements we've seen in our history. And many times when people retire, the job that the first volunteer role they take on, let's say they join a board or an advisor group, ends up being the top recipient of their philanthropy in their later years. So there's really opportunity for volunteer engagement for recently retired boomers. Over the next 5 years, we should see all of the boomer generation have hit retirement age. Not that they'll all retire, but well, we're expecting the biggest period of retirements in this 5 year period. But certainly that's happened with our own sector. There's been job changes moving around organizations. There's been an increased cost of labor. There's different expectations of flexibility that we're more remote. We're seeing more of a push back into the office in 2025. 2024 still being pretty remote by measure, and some hopes to close some of these gaps with AI and outsourcing, especially with FTE freezes. Even though we need work to get done, are there other tools and technologies that can help close those gaps? Continues to be a trend. Certainly, many are creating new ways to help transition people from other sectors to train and build their own. The one upside about fundraising is once people work in it, there's a pretty good job satisfaction in this profession. Our challenge is the entry point, not the retention point. Maybe our retention within an organization, but they often stay in the profession. And which I alluded to in the last slide, one of the biggest stories also has been that the budgets have required a broader view of ROI. growing interest in labor costs and enablement. Can we have one person do this task that we have a lot of people at a higher cost doing? Like, can we build up more operations to help offset so our fundraisers can spend more time in the field? Looking at extending through leverage staffing models, investing in operations, both for short-term and long-term returns. A lot of those questions of how do we measure the impact of operations, most specifically, is a question we received a ton of in 2024. And it's one that our firm has been doing a lot of thinking in. I realize that I talk long and I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to cut that there, but know that that's been a topic. And we've also seen continual changes in technology. Now, Salesforce has been the button across sectors, so not just in fundraising, but in corporate America and globally has been the largest growth segment. And it continued to grow in 2024 by 11%. It grew by 18% in 23. We're seeing a little slow in their growth, even though it continues to grow. Microsoft Dynamics has been climbing more so. Perhaps that's connection with AI and what's happening with Microsoft there. We've seen growth in marketing automation, which is like your marketing cloud or your HubSpot, and how we're interacting with broader based communities. And certainly the growth in AI has been substantial, 28% in growth in 2024 to 184 billion spent on it. By one measure, and it's hard. There's actually, I think we're still getting into how to measure that, but I trust in the power of Google on that statistic. We've also seen a big rise in the last few years of donor experience programs. Now, we've had stewardship, which is how we steward the gift that we got, make sure it's been used for the right way, it's communicated, it's acknowledged, and donor relations, maintain that relationship with the donor. But now thinking about what's that whole experience? What's it like to be a donor? What's their life cycle through our organization? How do we integrate our donor relations, our communications, our digital marketing, annual giving, events, experiences? My colleague James Barnard often mentions the fundraising between the asks, where we're measuring engagement and sentiment and really building community. That has been a big area of investment in 2024. All right, I'm trying to get to some predictions. These will be a little bit quicker, so I still have a few minutes for questions that hopefully I can get that my Q&A up so that I can see those questions as they came in. I'm only seeing the chat for now, but I will figure that out by the time we get there. All right, so we're moving through the predictions. First of all, I do predict that the 2024 numbers will be up when those are final. So as a review of 24, you're like, Josh, how did 2024 go? Well, we don't know yet, but I'm one of those economists that do believes the economic indicators and that there was optimism in the business sector. Now, this report on 2024, there's maybe some concerns in 2025 on tariffs and other pieces. Overall, the market indicates that the businesses have more optimism, at least in the market, but it's hard to say. Time will tell. But through 2024, the economic indicators that we've seen correlating with giving have been up. So that's my prediction. I also believe that the donor counts are going to keep declining, but I think we're pairing off these losses. I think they're not declining as much. So we're going to see kind of a slowdown of the decline. I think that the Giving Tuesday was a wonderful example. I think some investment into annual giving programs, higher education, for example, deciding like, all right, we're not giving up on alumni participation. We're going to turn this tide because the sustainability of our program and major donors of the future depend on us having a thriving base. I, I'm I wrote this slide before I started to call some of the folks that manage life income, and I said it's going to grow this year. It's already growing, so this is perhaps an easy prediction to make. And so if you've shifted away from, say, trusts and annuities, I would kind of maybe dust off a little bit of that. I think we're in a moment, especially as we're looking into this shift to retirement, where some of the life income arrangements might be really advantageous to some of your donors. We're going to see, we've seen a lot of success here and from many other companies and a lot of nonprofits of embracing the short form video content. Now, we've sort of had maybe a little shock to this prediction in TikTok. Will TikTok be around? It's sort of in a who knows kind of zone. But nevertheless, that form of authentic short form video is is really effective right now in the attention economy, and we're seeing the basic development really replicate attention economy activities in terms of digital content. I think we're going to see much more. It's rare that I'll go on TikTok or Reels or Xiaohongshu, the Red Note, or whichever short form video framework. Certainly, YouTube being strong for authentic video. I don't see many charities there. I see a few. I did see some St. Jude work from Gary Vaynerchuk and some others, but I expect that we'll start to see more in our feeds from the fundraising profession. I expect some consolidation in the fundraising service and technology sector. Over 23 and 2024, there's a lot of attention of private equity into the supporting ecosystem of fundraising, and there was a lot of private equity money that came in. And often within a couple of years of private equity, you'd expect to see consolidation. So I expect some mergers. So the companies you're working with, you're going to see more companies coming together. We did start to see that already in 2024. And also, partly because of the investment from Generosity Commission and the research there, the growth of the Science of Philanthropy Initiative, which has hundreds of researchers digging into philanthropy, we're starting to see kind of this new zone of academic research in philanthropy. And fortunately, a lot of this is funded through philanthropy, so I'm expecting some growth in academic research in philanthropy. We're going to see the fear of AI decrease as usage becomes commonplace. I think there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of us really asking those questions of not just are we going to use AI or should we use AI, but how can we use it in the right way as human beings. I know Alex from ETH, we were on a call earlier this morning and they're talking about the responsible use of AI. I just love that language. I'm gonna steal that from you all. ETH is really a leader in responsible AI in Switzerland. So that's what I have. That was sort of a review, and perhaps those predictions uh, were not the biggest predictions I could have made, but I hope they're helpful to you. In fact, I should actually share again the screen because I had this cool animation. Um, oh, it's not working. There we go. What do you predict? This is the time to put in the Q&A some of your questions, or if you have other predictions for people to see, you could just put those in the chat, or I'll try to speak to those. I actually use the Q&A function, and I'm going to put it on this screen for a second. As you're thinking about your questions, there will be a webinar, Momentum Matters, around comprehensive campaign success on Thursday, February 27th. Here's a little scan for that. And I'm going to leave that for a couple minutes, and then I'm going to try to remember to advance the slide because there's a QR code from my LinkedIn as well. So I'm going to, actually, I can't see the Q&A while I'm sharing, so I'm going to, hopefully you've all scanned that. If not, you'll get the recording and you can scan it off the recording. And here is my QR code. I'll leave that for a moment. It should be easy to find on LinkedIn if you're not able to scan that. And again, that will also be available on the recording because that'll have all of these slides. And I think I talked long enough, so you'll have a pause point on the recording to get this if you really want to reach out to me in that way. All right, I'm going to go to some of the Q&A. And there's a lot of good questions here. I'm going to try to select some. Let's see. There's a question about the outlier of election and rage giving, and I do want to talk about that because it is something we see in elections. It's been a growing trend. And what that is that when an election goes a certain way, people that nonprofits that represent the opposing view will often get a philanthropic bump. So it looks like the country's going this way, but these issues matter to me, so I give to the contrary position in my giving. We don't know yet, but that is what most the experts are predicting, is that there was a bump in certain areas that are on the opposite side of the winning party in terms of this election. But there's also been some interesting research from the Do Good Institute at University of Maryland on the connection between pro-social behavior. And what that is when people do civic things like serving on a jury, on voting, they're also more likely to volunteer and to give. So actually increased engagement in elections has a ripple effect of increased giving and volunteering. So we think because of the attention of the election that there's and people that give to elections are also more likely to give charitably. The fear has been that that's pulled away, but we actually see it's really more that it gets people in a pattern of giving. So we don't know for 2024 yet. There was certainly, we did see that perhaps the most noticeably in 2016. And there's a question on defining the religious category. It was houses of worship. Part of the decline of that segment is that a lot of other areas that historically were with denominations like, say, international relief or human services have really sort of split off denominations into what might be called paraministry or affiliated ministries. And they're now classified in the segments that they serve. So a faith-based international relief organization would be in the international relief segment. And I'm realizing that I'm actually at time and you all probably have hard stops. And so there's more questions here. I'm sorry that I talked too long. I nerded out on economics too much, but I want to thank you for attending. I will try to get some of those questions answered. Please reach out to me personally if I didn't get to your question, and I'm sorry that I didn't. I feel bad about that. I want to answer every question. I just love this so much, and not nearly as much as I love all of you. Thank you for doing what you do for the philanthropic profession. It's meaningful. I feel so motivated every time I work with all of you. I know what you're doing is better. It matters. You're making a real difference. And from here, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you, and have a wonderful 2025.